Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of FIREside Chat. I'm Joe Cohn, FIRE's Legislative and Policy Director, and today I'm going to be talking about some recent cases where elected officials pressured universities into censorship with two of my colleagues, Brynne Madway, staff attorney, and Tyler Coward, FIRE's Legislative Counsel. Thanks, both of you, for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
Happy to be here, Joe.
And thank you to the audience for checking this video out. So we're going to talk about a few cases. The first one took place recently at NYU, where Mayor de Blasio asked the university to cancel a planned speech by Milo Yiannopoulos on Halloween. And Milo was planning on talking about something particularly topical, the politics of Halloween costumes. We've seen Halloween costumes create controversy at Yale, and we've seen Halloween costumes create controversy actually at universities and in K-12 schools across the country. So it was a particularly timely topic, and one thing that I think is interesting is that the timeliness is really one of the key elements of this case. So what happened was a university professor invited Milo to give a talk on this topic to one of his classes, and the university says it found out about that just a few days beforehand, and the mayor urged the university to postpone but not cancel the speech. And the argument that the mayor made was that there's a Halloween parade taking place at the same time just a few blocks away, and it would spread his police department pretty thinly if they had to provide security for two controversial or potentially controversial things occurring at the same time. So he asked the university to postpone the speech, and the university gave into that request. So that's particularly troubling. And one of the reasons why we think it's troubling is because in free speech, timeliness really does matter. And I think that was the first point I was hoping to share with the audience today, was that there's a lot of case law about how delaying someone's ability to get out their message to their intended audience can have a tremendous negative impact. And something that is timely today is yesterday's news pretty quickly.
And I agree with you, Joe, and I think that is particularly true of a lot of what we've seen over the past couple of years, with a lot of protests coming up on the fly right away, and it's people responding to national news right away, and you lose something if that protest happens a day later, or 2 days later, or a week later. And I think here too, there's poignancy to having a conversation about Halloween costumes around Halloween. Waiting until Thanksgiving, it's a different conversation.
Right. Even a day after. I mean, if a speech is scheduled to go at Halloween, and then no one's really interested in hearing a lecture about Halloween the day after Halloween, sort of the moment has passed, or the prime opportunity moment to have that conversation has passed by that point.
Right. I mean, Halloween is, in any instance that's about a specific date, obviously has that temporal component right there. When I think about it, I think just back a few months when protesters were heading to airports,
of course,
over the alleged Muslim ban. So you have people coming in droves because there were folks who were not being let in the country at that time that were being held at entry points, and a tremendous amount of public pressure was placed to increase the dialogue and discussion about that had an impact on real people's lives at that moment. If people had to wait days and days and days to get permission to talk about that, the moment may have died down, something else may have taken up the news cycle. So that's the first point, is about the timeliness of speech being particularly crucial. But the next thing that kind of jumps out, to me at least, is the whole conversation is about, as the mayor frames it, the tension between public safety and free speech. And those tensions are real, but courts have addressed those tensions. They've addressed them over and over and over again, and this is not a new phenomenon. It goes all the way back to the civil rights movement,
right?
When there were civil rights marchers who wanted to march through southern towns, and mayors were saying that they didn't want the marchers there. And it wasn't just exclusively in the South, it was across the country. And mayors were making the argument that they would be unable to protect the communities, they'd be unable to protect the marchers themselves, and that riots could break out. And the question to the courts at that point was, well, can government postpone or even shut down speech for this public safety concern? And at least in those cases, just like was the situation here, there wasn't an allegation that the speakers themselves were going to be creating the problem. It was about people's reaction to the speech that would cause the problem. And if you allowed reactions to dictate whether or not someone could proceed, that's the classic heckler's veto. So that was kind of what those cases were concerned about and what we're still concerned about today with this situation at NYU. And what the Supreme Court says in a case called Gregory versus Chicago is that law enforcement has an obligation to analyze what resources they have to protect people in the exercise of their constitutional rights and to take reasonable steps to ensure people's access to those constitutional rights and that they can exercise them. And that's not a blank check to the ends of the earth. Sometimes the resources will not be there to produce an actual safe environment where people can be really harmed in real time. But law enforcement has to go through that effort, needs to show its homework. And it comes into play here in this situation because the mayor's office weighed in, and actually not the mayor's office, but the New York Police Department spokesperson said he was going to be sending a very large detail to the Yiannopoulos event. So the first thing is that demonstrates that they did have officers that they could send.
They had the resources available to respond to any sort of incident that might occur.
And then the de Blasio spokesperson says, in a tweet, he said, the NYPD can and would handle anything, but needlessly having this immediately adjacent to one of the biggest New York City events all year doesn't make a lot of sense. NYU is smart to reschedule to a different day. So what jumps out to me there is that the police department was saying that they did have the resources to send officers there. And that makes sense because it's one of the biggest police departments, maybe the biggest police department in the world. There are 38,000 officers in the NYPD police department. So presumably they could keep a classroom safe if they needed to. And then secondly, the spokesperson talks about it whether it was needless to have the speech there. And that kind of flips the legal analysis on its head. It's constraints on speech that need to fit strict scrutiny. You don't have to explain why it's needed for you to exercise your free speech rights. Individuals get to make that decision for themselves. So those are the things that jump out to me in this in this case.
You know, Joe, I think you hit the nail on the head there. The mayor flipped the First Amendment analysis there.
And NYU is not a public institution, so how do you think, Joe, should universities be sort of weighing this pressure from a government official to cancel a speech, even if they are not a government agency themselves, but instead a private institution?
Well, I think it's interesting because, of course, the First Amendment does only apply on public institutions because the First Amendment prohibits government action. But the one thing I try to remind as many people who will listen to me is that free speech is bigger than the First Amendment. Censorship goes beyond government censorship. If we look back at the Red Scare, a lot of people in private jobs lost their employment, and it destroyed their families. And we look back at that now as a dark day for the United States. So we should always look with a critical eye whenever anyone wants to engage in censorship. And here, of course, you have a government actor pressuring an institution to engage in the censorship, which is another factor to consider. But I want to talk now about a different case, one that recently took place in the state of Nebraska. And I want to turn it over to you, Brynne. Brynne, why don't you tell us about what's happening in Nebraska?
Thanks, Joe. So I think this is, a relatively simple, straightforward case. A representative, Jeff Fortenberry, is running for re-election and had some campaign posters out, and someone did deface one of them with, I think we can all agree probably juvenile humor, and changed Fortenberry to Fardenberry, added some googly eyes. And a professor at the school liked the photo on Facebook and then received a phone call from Representative Fortenberry's chief of staff, couldn't reach him, ended up, I think, either calling or emailing higher officials at the school to talk about it. Ended up having, I think it was about an hour-long conversation with the professor, Ari Cohn, a political science professor at the school, and they engaged on a variety of topics, but I think what we again have here is someone in government using their position of authority to engage in censorship by threatening the professor. The chief of staff says he didn't threaten the professor. The professor says he felt threatened. I wasn't there, I wasn't on the call, but I think it is very concerning anytime we have a government actor calling a private citizen to ask them to explain their speech. Of course, the government actor had a right, the chief of staff has a right to make that phone call, but once we have a chief of staff perhaps threatening someone, I think we've crossed a line.
But I think he didn't just call the professor. They reached out to the professor's boss.
Right, right.
And that's what makes it a little bit different here, is that you have not just the consequence of you might be criticized, but an implication there should be further consequences for expressive activity. Because there have been courts that have said that liking things on Facebook or anywhere else, on any other social media, count as expressive activity.
Sure. And the question that the chief of staff brought up, and something that I'd like to talk about here, is whether or not liking a picture of a campaign sign that has been defaced is incitement to vandalism, as was claimed by the chief of staff.
And I just don't think that it possibly can be. I think you have a right to like something, and he saw an image, he thought it was funny, and he clicked like. I think that's something we all do when we're browsing Facebook. It's something we all do, and I think it's a far cry from incitement to vandalism.
Right.
Well, incitement has a very specific test.
Exactly.
And the case is Brandenburg versus Ohio. And Brynne, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Brandenburg test?
Well, I think for incitement, what we're looking at is something that's going to cause imminent violence. We're not looking at something so far removed that there's no possible way in which it could cause someone to take an immediate
Are you
risk.
suggesting that if that post had one more Facebook like, that someone was likely to continue doing that vandalism?
I don't think I'm suggesting that. I think this was pretty far away from any form of incitement.
Right, and I think that was, I guess that was the point of my question is, the incitement test really does require that it would likely produce that kind of imminent, violence, and I just don't see it here.
No.
So,
and to infer from a Facebook like that the professor was trying to incite other people to vandalism seems like a far stretch to me. The most likely explanation that I could think of is that the professor thought that this sign, however it was defaced, was a funny outcome.
And I really don't like it when anyone defaces other people's signs.
Of course.
It is vandalism, and I think that it's a real problem when people don't respect other people's ability to get out their messages as they see fit. So it's certainly worth criticizing actual acts of vandalism. So our concern here at FIRE isn't the question of whether or not people should be looking at that act of vandalism with approval or to criticize it. Our concern is the more specific First Amendment concern of, should elected officials be pressuring public employers to take action against their employees for protected speech?
And that I think goes to the heart of it. And here, no, professors have a right to free speech. You don't give up your First Amendment rights when you accept a job as a professor at a university. So
that's been an interesting case, and it's been in the news a lot lately. There's a third case I wanted to talk about today.
Right.
And that's happening in Washington State. Tell us about that, Tyler.
So this case is a couple months old at this point, but it's from Washington State University. And what happened there is that there was a professor named Dr. Robert Weilgus, and he was the director of the Large Carnivore Conservation Laboratory at Washington State. And he was sort of a renowned expert in sort of wolf ecology. And he's also known for a controversial report saying that culling wolves if they attack cattle is actually counterproductive because it increases it sort of throws off the pack dynamics and actually will increase wolf reproduction. So we'll actually have the contrary results to what the proponents of culls actually want to see. I should say that I am not a wolf ecologist, so I cannot verify or the claims that he makes. But because he published this, a state representative in Washington pressured the university to. He was not only a state rep, but he was also a cattle rancher. Pressured the university to defund the professor's research by attaching a rider to a state bill, funding bill, and then the university sort of invoked that rider and then did defund the professor's research. And so when he was left without the means to continue producing conducting his research, he filed suit against the university.
Yeah, and my understanding is that that suit reached a settlement.
It did reach a settlement. He was awarded a $300,000 settlement and resigned as part of the settlement agreement as well.
So this looks like another case that really fits neatly into this mold of lawmakers using their positions to apply pressure on institutions to take action against people for exercising protected speech. Because research is unquestionably at the heart of academic freedom.
Of course.
Making arguments based on the results of your research is why we create research. So it seems to be pretty core protected speech to me. Is there any argument to the contrary that holds any water? Does it fit into any of the boxes of unprotected speech or exceptions to the First Amendment that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And I think what's interesting, and I think, Tyler, you hit it on the head when you said that you're not a large carnivore expert, is that this professor is, and he did his research, and he should be able to publish it. And I'm assuming he would have published something different if he had found something different. And that's sort of, I think, what academic freedom gets to, is we're letting experts do their research, and we don't know what they'll get to.
Well, sometimes I hear the argument, at least, that if research appears biased, that it should be somehow be allowed to be suppressed. And I'm unfamiliar with any exception to the First Amendment that says only speech that passes the purity of non-bias gets to be published. I think usually with research and academic research, you put it out there and others get to put it under scrutiny. I mean, that's part of the peer review process, but that's also part of the way that we handle the research is the back and forth of criticism.
Right. And that's something that, again, that we said, that the legislator was free to criticize the research that the professor put forward. The legislator was a cattle rancher and might have his own views on culling wolves that attack cattle, but criticizing the professor should be as far as it goes, or criticizing the research should be as far as it goes, and not calling for the defunding of all of his research.
Right, because defunding, as you noted and as the lawsuit points out, shut it down.
Right.
And anytime that we have fewer arguments out there in the public, we have less to evaluate, less to debate and discuss, and our policies, can be weaker as a result. Because that's really at the heart of better policies, is the ability to discuss, debate, argue, and hopefully through collective wisdom and democracy settle on better policies. And that doesn't happen when we shut down scientific inquiry.
And I think that's the marketplace of ideas, is that we inquire, we learn from each other, and we end up with the best result, and that's not going to happen if we're defunding something because we don't like the result.
And one of the things I want to talk about is these are 3 cases of public officials putting pressure on universities to censor or punish speech. How should universities be responding to elected officials putting pressure on them to violate their professors' constitutional rights?
Well, the public institutions are in a little bit of a precarious position because these legislators control a good chunk of their budgets. But regardless of the degree of pressure, whether it comes from these lawmakers, whether it comes from any other source, they need to be doing an honest analysis of the principles at play. And here we're talking about one that is so essential to the functioning of an institution, free speech, academic freedom, that without those principles, a university isn't really engaging in the kind of activity that we expect and producing the kind of academic environment that we need for our civilization to thrive. So they need to stand up to it regardless of the pressure. And that's true whether it comes from an internet mob, whether it comes from their own students, whether it comes from the media, or whether or not it comes from lawmakers. And what concerns me when it's coming from lawmakers is that they are particularly powerful, at least in relation to the institutions. And they're in a tremendous position to either do good with their public offices or to cause harm here. So I get worried when lawmakers intervene with institutions in a way that stifles expression.
And I think you're absolutely right, Joe. And I think that the message, the only thing I'd add, I think, is that the message goes beyond lawmakers to really anyone who has that ability to influence an institution, whether it's an online mob, a lawmaker, a large donor. It's important that universities protect these core freedoms that make them universities, freedom of speech, and academic freedom from all these external pressures.
Right. And one other thing about lawmakers that I think is worth talking about, which is we've seen lawmakers exert pressure on institutions a lot at FIRE. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we created a legislative and policy department, was specifically to help improve the dialogue with lawmakers and intervene in instances when we were seeing government actors cause censorship on college campuses. I mean, that's the reason why I have a job here. That's the reason why Tyler has a job here. So we've been dealing with that for a while. For example, the University of Tennessee was under tremendous pressure from Tennessee lawmakers over students spending student activity fees on sex weeks, and that happened in 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and again in 2018. For those of you watching, there's a little bit of a trend. So I would like to wrap up on this point here, which is illustrated in Tennessee, which is that even after years of Tennessee lawmakers calling for censorship, they got together and passed the best bill in the country for campus free speech. So a lawmaker can be on the wrong side of a free speech controversy one time and the next day do the right thing. And that's why we're here, is to continue to have dialogue with them, to encourage them to be a force for good here. So with that, I want to thank Tyler and Brynne for joining me today for this conversation, and I want to thank you all, for joining us at this Fireside Chat. Have a good day.